Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at Unity's new features for working with 2D games. We're primarily going to be setting up our project, bringing in some of our textures, talking about how sprites work, and then placing a couple in our level. So let's go ahead and do that. The first step is going to be to fire up Unity, not surprisingly.
Woohoo!
Yeah. Go ahead and hit create new project. I have a particular folder that I want to stuff this project into if my other screen can stop being dumb. Okay, and then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that we will set up our defaults for 2D. I'll go over the differences between setting up for 3D and setting up for 2D once we get into Unity, but I will point out that setting up for 3D versus 2D isn't going to make any changes that can't be modified later. So let's go ahead and make sure that we have 2D selected, but we will go over all of the things that is different when we do select 2D. So let's go ahead and hit create, and we'll get a Unity project. Alrighty, so we have a project. There's a couple of things to notice if you've never created a 2D project before, and the most glaring of them is going to be our scene view. Because if we look in our scene view, I can go in and I can middle mouse click around to pan, and I can zoom in with the mouse wheel, and I can drag to select. I can hold down right mouse button and I'll drag around, but you'll notice something kind of odd. What we're seeing here is an orthographic view of our scene, and specifically we're seeing it on the XY plane as opposed to a projection camera or a perspective camera where we would see all three axes. So that setting of seeing our scene view in a 2D mode is controlled by this little toggle button right here, 2D. If I were to uncheck it, we would see the familiar 3D scene view with our projection or perspective. Why do I keep on saying projection?
I don't know.
With our perspective projection. There, I was able to include the word projection in there. So we see everything in 3D just like we normally would. So that's going to be the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things that we are going to notice right off the bat when we create a 2D project. Now you can switch between 2D and 3D whenever you want. And in some cases, switching between 2D and 3D will actually be beneficial even if you're creating a 2D game. And we'll take a look at that here in a moment. Another interesting thing that has changed when you create a 2D project as opposed to a 3D project is the main camera that's by default created is an orthographic camera and not a perspective camera. Now, the difference between orthographic and perspective cameras is that our orthographic camera is a flat projection of the XY plane, or whatever plane that we're pointing the camera at. So you'll notice that when we click on it, our gizmo that we see is this huge long 3D rectangle. Now, of course, if you created a project in 3D, there's nothing stopping you from creating a perspective camera, or sorry, an orthographic camera. And if you created a project in 2D, there's nothing stopping you from creating a perspective camera. So let's really quickly run down the difference between orthographic and perspective so that people might be able to, or just to give people context of why it's important that we have an orthographic camera. This might be review for some people, but it is very important to understand because it's also going to impact the way that we build our 2D game. And it's going to maybe cause some problems that we should be able to identify easier if we understand the differences.
Show me the magic.
All right. So effectively, what we're looking at is the camera select, and we see this gizmo, and this gizmo is the projection of the camera. Everything inside of this three-dimensional object will be rendered, and it'll be projected onto a 2D screen. We can see a preview of that down here in our camera preview. So if I go ahead and create a cube, for example, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to split my game view with my scene view. The reason I'm doing that is so that we can see both of them side by side. So I can modify my, my cube over here, and I can see what it'll look like in the camera. So you'll notice something interesting. An orthographic camera does not use any information from the z-axis. Effectively, when you perform an orthographic projection and project an orthographic scene into a two-dimensional plane, you're chopping off one of the axes. And in this case, we're chopping off the z-axis. You'll see that the blue handle is indeed the z-axis, because up here the blue axis is pointing in the positive z direction. An interesting consequence of this is if I were to duplicate this cube and then move it over here and then bring it all the way back on the z-axis, or all the way forward on the z-axis, you'll see no difference. That's very different from what you would see if we instead had a projective projection. If I click back on the camera, we can modify whether we have a or a perspective or orthographic projection by modifying the projection property, not surprisingly. And if I come over here to projection and select perspective instead, then we'll see the kind of camera that you would be used to if you are familiar with Unity and working in 3D. Now we can
foreshortening.
Indeed. Now we have an example of foreshortening, where this object, since it's closer to the camera, is bigger than this object, which is further away from the camera. So you'll see that because we can modify the object on the z-axis, and we get a different screen on the left-hand side, we can see that the information from the x-axis is being included in the math behind the projection. Whereas again, if I were to select this and go to an orthographic view, we will see that that z-axis information has been completely chopped off. Okay, so let's talk about why we would ever want to switch between 2D and not 2D. So I set the camera back to orthographic because that's what we'll be using in the game. Because this will be a 2D game, we don't want any perspective. When we select 2D up here in the scene view, what that's doing is the scene view's camera is now in an orthographic view. So that's really cool. In Unity, the scene view is actually implemented as a camera. There's an actual camera in Unity, like an actual real camera object in Unity. It's hidden, of course, but it's what's used to project or show us our scene view. And you'll see that this is now, when you select 2D, it is now a orthographic projection as opposed to a perspective projection. And I can toggle this on and off. Now, we'll see a lot more interesting things about cameras and some of the math behind cameras, including what the orthographic size means, later in this series when we talk about our camera controller. But for now, I only want to point out one more thing about the 2D toggle, and that is there exists a possibility that an object will be visible in the 2D view, but will not be visible in your camera, because of the fact that Unity is a 3D engine and everything is a 3D object. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if I uncheck 2D and I grab one of these objects and I place it behind the camera, then I click on 2D, notice how that object is still visible in my scene view. But if I were to click over to game, we only see one cube, we don't see two. That's because although this is indeed an orthographic camera and it's having an orthographic projection, it's still a 3D object in the world. Anything with in this case, because we have the camera aligned on the z-axis, anything that has a z value smaller than the z value of the camera will not appear on the camera. So see, if I move the camera up, we can see that that cube appears, disappears, appears, disappears, and so on. So I'm going to reset this back to -10 on the z-axis. So I want to point this out so that we can talk about a very basic debugging technique that we might need to use while developing 2D games in Unity, and that is when you ever have a situation where you can see an object in the scene view when you're in the 2D mode, that doesn't mean that your camera can see it too, because your camera is a three-dimensional object and it will chop off anything that is further along or behind it on the z-axis. I also want to point out one more small thing. This is just kind of trivial, but I want to mention it. People typically equate in the coordinate system that we're using here, a left-handed coordinate system. People typically equate positive x with right, positive y with up, and then positive z with forward. And you can see this by holding up your left hand, extending your thumb out so it's parallel with the floor, and then taking your middle finger and pointing it forward. And you'll see that we have that configuration of axes. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you were to make a 2D game, Z had to be forward and Y had to be up, because I'm thinking that there's at least someone out there who might be thinking, well, if Y is always up, then, well, how do I make like a game that's a shooter that always goes forward? You know, what if I wanted a top-down view? Well, that really doesn't matter. These axes are arbitrary, and you should really think of, although we are looking at the XY plane here when we click on 2D, that doesn't mean that we're only going to be looking up in the positive Y and right on the positive X, because in reality, if you wanted to make this a top-down game, all you do is change the artwork. You wouldn't necessarily have to change any of the math or any of the positioning. So the fact that the 2D...
Basically, our game is floating in space. And so it's all relative how you're looking at it.
Yeah. I don't know if anything that I said just made sense to anybody, though, but... yeah.
Basically, you just have to make all of your axes correlate the way you want.
Exactly.
To get the look.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, because I try to imagine what people might wonder when they're looking at this. The fact that the 2D button up here will always lock on the YX plane doesn't mean that we are only limited to side scrollers. It's basically what I was trying to express, and I used like 2 minutes of a bunch of gibberish to do so, because that's how good I am at explaining things.
Yeah, well, the axis doesn't change, but if you do all your artwork so that you're looking at the tops of everything, you've just turned it into a top-down game without changing anything. So,
right, it's not going to affect the physics or anything like that. But all right,
I followed you.
Sweet. Well, at least one person did. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about with cameras for now. Again, we're going to talk a whole lot more about the math behind an orthographic camera when we get to doing that. But for now, I'm just going to remove these cubes. Let's go ahead and talk about another big new feature in Unity 4.3, and that's going to be sprites.
Yay, sprites are cool.
Yes, sprites are cool. So Unity has traditionally been a 3D engine, but obviously 2D games are very popular, so Unity finally introduced the concept of a sprite. And a sprite, if you're not familiar with it, is really just a texture or a picture that we can move around on the screen. If you're familiar with Mario, you know, Mario himself would be a sprite, the Goombas would be a sprite, the blocks would be sprites, the background would be a sprite. So really it's a texture that we can render onto the screen. And that might sound like something you could already do with Unity, and that is correct. But Unity 4.3 has introduced a bunch of new features that make working with sprites a whole lot easier. So what we're going to do for the rest of this video is we're going to put together or bring in our sprites, and then we're going to kind of create a basic looking level, and we're going to build together or build our character together, put him together and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here down to my project window, and I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it textures. And then I'm going to bring in all of the textures that are provided with this video series. Our background atlas 2, background atlas, our start, our texture atlas main, and our talented ball. So I'm going to do that by just click dragging on all of these guys and dropping them in to textures.
And a virtual cookie to anybody who knows why we used a character called Talented Ball.
Yeah. Bit of 3D Buzz history there. So now we have our textures brought in. You'll notice something interesting that you wouldn't have noticed if we were working with a 3D project, and that is we can expand each one of these, and we get these little guys right here in addition to the main texture. Now the reason we see that is because these textures are being brought in as a texture type of Sprite 2D. Now, Sprite is going to be a new texture type in Unity that allows us to mark a texture as a sprite. As opposed to something that might be mapped onto a three-dimensional object, we want Unity to treat this as a sprite. I'll point out one more thing, though. If your textures did not get imported as a sprite by default, it is possible that you created a 3D project and not a 2D project. To change the behavior of that, you could either A, come in here to each one of the textures and make sure you have texture type of sprite enabled, or B, come up here under Edit, Project Settings, Editor. And we'll see right here there's a new option called Default Behavior Mode, and its default in this case is going to be 2D because we selected a 2D project. Otherwise it'd be called 3D or set to 3D. So I want to point that out as another difference between what happens when you select that little drop down when you create a Unity project. Okay, so let's start with something easy. Let's start with our background atlas. You'll notice that all of these guys but our start screen are indeed atlases. And what do I mean by atlases? Well, let's take a look at them. I'm going to click and drag out start. And we'll talk a little bit more about what just happened when I did that in a moment. But for now, just know that when you click and drag one of these guys out, you will get that image here in Unity. And then I'm going to drag out our, how about our texture atlas main? Now you'll notice that our texture atlas main is a texture atlas. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's a massive texture that includes a bunch of individual textures that we will be using in our game. And what we'll want to do is we'll want to cut this texture atlas up so that we can render each one of those pieces separately. You'll notice that Steve made use of the alpha channel in order to make these objects transparent so that we can just cut it up and place those objects individually within our scene.
Now, why would we want to do that, Nelson?
Well, the biggest reason is going to be for performance. By loading in a single texture of 1024 by 1024 or 2048 by 2048 and having multiple objects come from the same texture atlas, that makes it so the video card only has to load in one texture. Then all those additional objects, whether it's a blue buzzsaw or a red buzzsaw, they'll reference the exact same texture in video memory or VRAM as the other objects that come from the same texture sheet. The difference will simply be the UV coordinates that those sprite objects use. Now, fortunately, we won't even have to touch UVs in this entire series because of the stuff that's built into Unity now. But that's effectively what's going to happen here, is that all of these any of these textures will reference the same object in memory, and then all of these objects only have to be loaded once into memory.
Yeah, I like to think of it as like an actual portfolio, physical portfolio of pictures. What's going to be easier to find? Flipping through a bunch of different pictures looking for the one you want, or one picture that has all of them on it in a little picture?
Yeah, like a collage.
Yeah, and it's the same for your computer. It's going to be easier for it, faster for it to locate that on one sheet than to flip through all the sheets looking for the one it wants.
Yeah, so that's effectively what Steve did when he put together this texture sheet was to, or an atlas is what it's called, is to place all of them onto a single texture. So that's very handy. You'll notice in stark contrast, however, our start screen is just one texture. So this is the most simplest form of texture or of a sprite, and that's just going to be one huge texture. Then we have an example of a texture atlas. Now you'll notice that the behavior of us pulling in this texture atlas is not exactly what we're looking for, because we don't really want all of our buzzsaws and all of our enemies and all of our tubes to look like buzzsaws, enemies, and tubes at the same time, because that would look that just imagine a bunch of the little guys like this running around. Like imagine if this
confusing.
Yeah, if this was our level. Yeah, it wouldn't work very well. So obviously we're going to be wanting to do something inside of Unity to tell Unity that this texture atlas actually consists of multiple sprites that we want to use. Whereas with this, we won't need to. So I'm going to delete the texture atlas from here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when we pull in a texture and drop it into our scene. So I'm going to delete that again, and I'm going to come back down here, and I'm going to click and drag either start or its child object start onto the screen. Now you might be thinking, well, why does it have a child object named the same thing, and why does it do the same thing if I were to drag either one? The answer is what we're really dragging is this one, but when we drag the parent, it'll act like we're dragging the first object out. And like we said with texture atlases, when we have texture atlases, we'll have multiple ones of these. But Start is a good example because it's very simple and it's not an atlas. So what happens when we pull out one of these sprites? And again, this will only happen if we make sure that our texture type is set to sprite. Well, what's going to happen is Unity is going to create a game object that has a transform just like usual, but it'll also have something else really cool on it, and that's called the sprite renderer. The sprite renderer is this awesome component that renders sprites, not surprisingly. It's similar, I guess you could say, to a mesh renderer. But it differs in a couple of ways. So first of all, what we have here is the sprite that it references. You'll notice that when I click on this, so this is just another proof of what I said before, is the behavior of dragging this is the same as behavior as dragging this because this appears first. If I were to delete this, pull start over again, and then click on the sprite, notice what gets highlighted. So the first object in that list. So this is the sprite asset that it's referencing. Then we have the sorting layer and the ordering layer, which we'll talk about a little later in this video. Then we have the material, just like what we would have with a mesh renderer, but we also have something else that's really cool, and that is the color. This is one important way that a sprite renderer differs from a mesh renderer. So if you're familiar with shaders, you know that a material is a collection of shaders, and that material can pass parameters into those shaders, and those parameters are baked into the material itself. That's the case typically with the main color of a shader. The main color of the shader is going to be encapsulated in the material, not in the renderer. So changing those two things independently will be very difficult. If you were to have two objects that reference the same material, changing that color would change the color for both of those objects because the color is baked into the material. However, with the sprite renderer, they did something smart, which I like a lot, which is bring the concept of a tint color from the material, and they stuffed it on the renderer itself, which is really cool because now I can independently modify the color of the texture just by coming in here and changing the color of the sprite renderer without modifying the material or any other sprites that might share the same material. You'll also notice that the material, the sprite's default material, does support transparency. So I'm also able to modify the transparency of the sprite, which would be very useful for a variety of different effects that you might want to do in your game. Okay, so that's the sprite renderer, and that's what happens when we drop a sprite from our project into our scene view. Again, it creates an object with a sprite renderer, with the sprite referencing the sprite that we dragged out. So that's really cool, and we're going to be using that a lot in order to construct our level. In fact, our level will be almost entirely constructed out of objects that have a sprite renderer that reference a particular sprite. Okay, so that's pulling in a very simple sprite, but we have some non-trivial sprite sheets up here. We have our background atlases, and we have our texture atlas main, and our talented ball. So let's go ahead and start with our background atlases. These will actually be a little easier to work with than our texture atlas main. So we'll start off with the easier case first. So again, this is an atlas. If I drag it out, we'll see that we have three distinct textures on it, but Unity thinks there's only one texture. Unity sees one texture and it makes one sprite out of it. What we need to do is we need to tell Unity that this is actually a 4x4 grid of individual textures and I want to pull them all out. So let's go ahead and do that. To do that, we're going to have to take a look at our inspector for our texture import. And you'll see right here we have a sprite mode, and it's currently set to single. Now this sprite is actually a 2048 by 2048 texture, which means that in addition to modifying some of these other properties, we'll definitely want to come down here to our max size and change it to 2048 so that we don't get any compression artifacts. That being said, it probably wouldn't matter. You probably wouldn't see that many artifacts between 1024 and 2048. And definitely if you're on mobile, so like if you want to deploy this to an iPhone, you'll definitely want to override this setting and scale down the max size. But the great thing about working with 2048 by 2048 textures is you can always go down, but you can't always go up in size. So by having a ridiculously large texture, we can make it as big or as compressed as we want to. But I will go ahead and set this to 2048 before we start playing around with the sprite sheet. And then, of course, because I made a modification, I have to hit apply. Okay, so coming back up here to the sprite mode is currently set to single, which instructs Unity that we have a single sprite inside of this object. But not surprising.
That's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we definitely want to cut these guys up. So, not surprisingly, we come up here to single, and we can change it to multiple, which sounds like exactly what we want to do. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we now have a sprite mode of multiple, and you won't notice immediately much changing. If I were to go ahead and hit apply, right down here, you'll actually notice our sprite disappeared. So watch what happens when I try to drag over here. It won't even let me. In fact, we're getting warnings saying texture being dragged has no sprites. So yeah, we definitely have a problem here. We selected multiple, but we haven't told Unity how to cut it up yet. To do that, we have to click on the sprite editor, which is a button that will enable us to modify the properties of our sprite. In this case, we can use the sprite editor to cut up our image in a variety of different ways. The first way that we can use it to cut up our image is by click and dragging. So this box represents an individual sprite, and I can click and I can drag it, and I can create another one, click and drag, and then click and drag, and it's really boring and monotonous. And you probably don't want to do that. So
yeah, something like this, it wouldn't be that bad, but if, like the other sheet,
yeah,
that's a lot of work.
Yep. And fortunately, guys over Unity recognized that and made it very easy to automatically slice up an image. If I come up here to slice, this is going to provide us the panel that will allow us to do automatic slicing. Now there's a couple types of automatic slicing. There's automatic, which we'll take a look at a little later because it's a little bit more complicated. And then there's grid. Grid is actually very, very easy to use because it literally just makes it Unity think of your entire texture as a grid of other subtextures. And by specifying the pixel size parameters of each one of these cells in the grid that you created, it'll allow Unity to construct a sprite sheet based off of those numbers. So we know that this texture is 2048 by 2048, and we know it's in 4 cells, and therefore we know that each one of these cells is 1024 by 1024. So let's go ahead and type in 1024 by 1024. Let's keep the offset to 0 and the padding to 0. Let's keep the pivot to center. We'll be talking a little bit more about pivots later, but for now we'll just leave it at center. Let's go ahead and hit slice. What we get now are 3 slices. Unity was smart enough to realize that there wasn't anything in the lower right hand corner, so it didn't make a texture out of it. But what it did do is it constructed 3 slices of our image to result in the creation of 3 sprites. Now imagine you had a character animation. The character animation was like 40 sprites long. This will save you a lot of time by using the grid mode slicing, because then you just load it up as a strip or as a square of your animation textures, and then you'll get a very nice cut by simply selecting slice after inputting the size of your individual cells.
And also handy that it recognizes when there's nothing in a cell, because then you don't have to make your animation fit a perfect square. It'll just ignore.
All right, so now that we have these 3 guys, let's go ahead and name them. You'll notice if I click on them, I can modify their properties by setting their name and also setting their pivot. Again, we won't worry about pivot. So let's go ahead and set the name of these mountains. Let's do mountains. That better be how you spell mountains, or I'm going to be... Yeah, there we go.
It is. You're good.
Sorry, my brain. Can't brain today. I have the dumb. So we'll call these mountains blue, and we'll call these mountains teal, and then we'll call this background. All right, but we're not done yet. There's a very, very small, I think like 20 by 50 pixel button on this UI that we have to click before our settings are actually changed. Just to be consistent with all the other, apply buttons in Unity. In order to apply your changes to your sprite sheet, you must hit the apply button.
Yeah, they really made that stick out for you.
Yeah, they did. I'm sure if I clicked off of it, it would have like warned me or something, but I don't know. Anyway, either way, make sure you hit the apply button, and then let's close out of our sprite editor. Actually, I can probably just dock my sprite editor with my scene view so I can have some more room the next time I use it. Okay, so now what we have is our BG background atlas is now broken up into 3 sprites: our background, our mountains blue, and our mountains teal. So let's see what happens when I click and drag BG Atlas out now. You'll notice that I get this object, and actually it brought in blue for some reason. So it's not the first one in that case.
That's what I was expecting. That's kind of weird.
Just don't do it, guys. Just if you want a specific texture out of a texture atlas, just go ahead and select one of these individual textures. I will point out, just briefly point out one cool feature. This will make a whole lot more sense in a couple videos when we talk about animation. But if we control click on all of these guys and bring them in, it'll actually, I'm not going to hit save, I'm going to hit cancel. But if I were to hit save, it would create a sprite-based animation that flips through each one of these textures on a new game object in our scene. So
really handy for characters.
Yeah, if you, like what Steve was talking about earlier, if you have this huge strip of sprite animations for your character's run cycle or something, just click drag or click control or shift click and drag, and you will have a built animation built for you right there without doing any work. So that's really cool. Okay, so now we can pass in our backgrounds, we can pass in our mountains blue and our mountains teal. So that is pretty cool. You'll notice that currently our sorting order is actually surprisingly fine. That won't always be the case. We'll definitely talk about sorting layers or sorting order very shortly here. But I want to go ahead and place these guys in our scene. The way that I'm going to orient this game is I'm going to consider 0, 0, 0 to be the bottom left corner of the game world. So we'll want to start putting our mountains and stuff at that 0, 0, 0. And let's just place a couple mountains. Now let's place the background. You'll notice that it's going to be kind of difficult to resize the background in the way we want. What we actually want is we want this background to be a strip across our game. You'll notice that when I try to resize it, no matter how I try to resize it, this way, that way, this way, that way, it will stretch it proportional to its aspect ratio. That's actually going to be a consequence of its pivot. Currently, its pivot is set to be the center of the background. But what I want to do is I want to set the pivot to the left. And what that'll allow me to do is it'll allow me to stretch it to the right without it resizing in all directions. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click on background. Well, no, I'm not. I'm going to click on BG Atlas, and I'm going to come up here to Sprite Editor again. I'm going to select background. Now there's a couple ways I can do this. I can grab its pivot and I can move it to the left. And you'll notice that I actually set the pivot to the left because I could have accomplished the same thing by coming here and saying left. So you'll notice that it does snap to the individual places.
Which is handy because you can really go awry with pivots if you're not careful.
Yeah. No, it's very nice that they allowed us to modify our pivots and that it snaps properly. You'll also notice something else interesting about the pivot. You might be saying, oh, wow, well, that looks like a number. But in reality, that's actually a relative offset, where 0 is the 0, 0 is the bottom left of the image and 1, 1 is the top right of the image. You can think of it like percentages, where 0, 0 is 0% and 1, 1 is 100%. So you'll notice when I drag it over to the left, the pivot becomes 0.5. But what's cool about this is you can actually move the pivot around into places that aren't on one of the corners or one of the sides of the object. This is actually going to be really cool. The same pivot system is used on their new GUI, and it's going to be really cool when it comes out, the different things you'll be able to accomplish using pivots. But for now, we're going to snap this over to the left, and then we're going to hit this really big and obvious apply button. And then we're going to come back to our scene. So now we see that our pivot is on the left. I do want to reset my scale back to 111 to show you guys what'll happen now if we move... Oh, come on. There we go. So what I'm doing is I'm holding down Control, and I'm moving that corner over. So you'll see it kind of gets squished a little bit, but if I hold down Control, I can grab this little lower right corner and I can move it out so that I can stretch it on the whole level. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to position it here at 0, 0, 0. Actually, you know what? I want to set the pivot to the lower left-hand side. I just decided, and I get to make those decisions because this is my game.
I feel bad now because I wondered about that, but I trusted you.
You should have said you should have pointed that out. Then I wouldn't have looked stupid in front of everyone. All right. So for real this time, we're setting our pivot to the bottom left, and then I'm coming back to the scene. And now you'll notice that when I set the position of this object to 0, 0, 0, it now properly orients itself to the origin. Now let's go ahead and just change the X scale just by using the drag thing. I'm not going to worry about trying to use these little handles, and instead I'm just going to drag up on our X property of our scale vector, and let's make it like that. Also, let's make it a little bit taller, and so you'll notice it's really cool now that I can make it taller and I can move it to the right just by modifying the scale numerically. Maybe that's a little bit too tall.
Now that's a sky.
All right, I think that should be good for our purposes. But yeah, so that is going to be our background. So next up, let's go ahead and cut up our BG Atlas 2 real fast. So again, just to go through this procedure again, I'm going to click on BG Atlas 2. I'm going to make sure that I set its max size to 2048. Hit apply. Go to the sprite mode and select multiple. Hit sprite editor. Then I'm going to want to go ahead and come up here to slice. Grid by 1024 by 1024. Pivot center. Hit slice. I now get 4 images, which is really nice. And then I hit apply. Well, actually, I might want to name these. I'll call this background. I'll call this teal upper. I'll call this teal lower. And I'll call this is the foreground, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the foreground. So that's teal upper, that's teal lower, that's background, that's foreground. Hit apply, and you'll see our names are going to be reflected now down here. Okay, so now we have our 2 background atlases imported. I'm not going to place any of the level 2 on this yet because this scene that we're working with will eventually become level 1. Our start needs no more work. I'm going to set the max size up to 2048, however. Which 2048 is huge. You probably wouldn't notice much of a difference if you set it to 1024 and everything, but that's something that you can play around with when you're going to optimize for different devices.
And that goes back to you being a programmer. When you tell an artist what you want, an artist is almost always going to send you the biggest possible resolution he thinks he can get away with.
Yeah.
So
And then that gives the programmer or whoever is in charge of this the flexibility to choose a lower resolution with compression, depending on the device. But if your device supports it, you get a very nice high-resolution image. All right, next up, let's work on our ball. So if we look at our ball, I'm going to come up here. What? I actually forgot the dimensions of this guy. He is 1024 by 104. Yeah, he's 1024 by 1024.
I made him big.
Yeah, he's big. He honestly probably could very easily be 512 by 512.
Or even 256.
I'm just going to leave it at 1024. Again, optimization is going to be something that's going to be dependent on your situation and your target platforms, and that's something that you guys can experiment with yourself.
Well, and the nice thing in Unity is if you click through those various buttons for the device, it kind of says, and like there's grayed out, but it says max 1024. It's kind of telling you, yeah, lower it down.
But, all right, so let's click on our ball. 1024 is a good size. Let's set the sprite mode to multiple. Hit apply. Let's hit the sprite editor, and let's cut this guy up. Well, we're going to have a problem because our grid isn't going to work right, and I really don't want to manually do all of these. So our other option is to come up here to slice, and instead of selecting grid, to select automatic. Even though when you select it, it says to obtain more accurate slicing results, manual slicing is recommended. It's like, here, I'm going to select this feature, and the feature's like, don't use this feature.
Don't use me.
No, it'll be fine.
But it actually works pretty well.
Yeah, it does. They just don't have any confidence in themselves, apparently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select automatic. I'm going to keep delete existing, and I'm going to hit slice. What do we get? Well, if we come in here and zoom in, we will see that the ball has indeed been sliced. We see these things have been sliced. Those have been sliced. Microphone hands have been sliced. Those are hands, right? Yeah.
Those are hands. Those are his white gloves.
Okay. Then we see his feet have been sliced. So indeed, everything on our player has been sliced properly. So let's go ahead and name stuff. Let's call this his body. What are these? These are his shoulders?
Parts of his eyes.
Oh, those are eyes. This is going to be his right eye, right?
Yes.
And this will be his left eye. And this will be his right eye white. Left eye white. I think these are these the same thing?
Yeah, the hands doesn't matter. Make them whichever way you want.
Okay.
One right, one left. And we probably could have done it as just a single hand, but
yeah,
as an artist, it was easier for me to stack them and see what I was doing.
Yeah, it'll be fine. And if we code it like this, then we can change it later if we want the hands to look different. So, are these the same-ish?
No, that's the one on the left is the right.
All right, this is the right foot, and then we have our left foot.
Slightly bigger.
All right, so now we have our talented ball cut up. Let's go ahead and hit apply. And indeed, we have our body, left hand, left eye white, left foot, right eye white, right foot. I'm going to change this from hand left to left hand. And hand right to right hand, just so I'm consistent with the naming of these individual sprites. And, all right, that looks good. So that's our talented ball. Now the last one is going to be our texture atlas main. So our texture atlas main is going to require us, we can't do a grid. We can do the automatic, but we'll see in a moment here that the automatic won't work properly for all of these sprites. So we'll see an example of how we can go in and manually correct the automatic slicing ourselves. So the first thing we're gonna do is set the max size default to 2048 and hit apply. Then we're gonna change from single sprite mode to multiple sprite mode. Then we're gonna load up our sprite editor, which is already open. We're gonna go to slice, automatic, center pivot, and delete existing, and we're gonna hit slice. Then close this window out. So on first inspection, it might look like it did a pretty good job. Well, it did do a pretty good job, but there are going to be some slight problems. So I encourage people who ever use automatic slicing on a texture atlas to go in and make sure that everything is correct, because we'll see some obvious errors and some not so obvious errors. If we come over here and zoom in, you'll notice that it picked out 2 bubbles and ignored the rest, which is kind of weird. I don't know how it came to that conclusion. But
yeah, that's bizarre. But
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. To fix it, we just gotta delete one of these guys, select the other one of these guys, zoom in, and since I don't think there's any feathering, I can make it a pretty tight fit. There we go, and we have our bubbles. So let's go ahead and call these bubbles. Next up, we have our grass. What do we want to call this? Grass. And we see that it is indeed cut up properly. We can even zoom in all the way and we see that since there isn't any feathering on those, that it's fine that it chopped down just a little bit. Now let's come down here and we see that that indeed worked. So let's call this grass 2 because it's also grass. Moving along.
Because we're not very creative with our naming conventions.
No, well, at least I'm not. No.
Well, all you got out of me was so.
All right. So next up, we have our things. Our what do you call these things? Pogo sticks.
These are called punji sticks. Punji.
Punji. Where does that come from?
That's what those traps like in the Vietnam War.
Okay.
So I guess it's Vietnamese, but they're called punji sticks.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get our punji sticks in. I want to make sure that it's a very tight fit around these hard edges, and it is. And then if we scroll up, yeah, we see it's a tight fit with those spikes. So that's exactly what we want. Next up, we have our health pack. So let's go ahead and click on that. We see that is indeed a good fit, and we'll call this health pack. Next up, we have our star, which our star is a pretty good fit too. So let's call this star. Next up, we have our cannon. Looks like our cannon was brought in pretty good. Next up, we have some problems. You'll notice because of the feathering on this green object, there wasn't enough completely transparent pixels between the green object and this object up here that Unity decided it was one whole object. That's obviously not the case. We will notice, however, that it got these corners in properly, but if we scroll down, we'll see that it's including a sprite that needs to be separate. So to fix that, let's just go up and make sure we get a tight fit. I think that's good. What is this? More bubbles?
That's the water trap.
Water trap. Okay. All right. So now we have our water trap, which is I definitely want this because again it has hard edges. It's supposed to be tiled. Anything that has hard edges and is supposed to be tiled, I want to have as tight a fit as possible. And if we look at our lower left corner, it's pretty tight. And if we look at our upper right corner, it's tight also. So that's exactly what we want. Next up, we have this green thing. Now,
our jump pad.
Jump pad. So you'll notice that we actually have some feathering going on here. And that's what confused Unity in the first place. If we scroll in all the way, we'll see that it does have a hard edge on the left. However, you'll see that the green tint goes all the way up to about here. Maybe a little bit lower than that, but I'm just going to go with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define that as the top left corner. I'm going to scroll over to... Oh, you got to be kidding me. If I click drag, it doesn't... Okay, so I'm just going to release, come over here, and I'm going to bring this all the way over to the right-hand side. You'll notice that it indeed clamps to the texture, which is exactly what we want. Then I'm going to take this and I'm going to find our lower bound, and our lower bound ends right about there. Okay, so that should preserve the nice little glowing effect on the sprite by including the feathered pixels.
And giving you the opportunity to yell at me for doing that to you.
It's fine. All right, so next up we have our platform. Oh, hold on, I gotta name this. Let's name this our jump pad. Next up we got our platform thing. I'm just gonna call this dirt. You'll notice that it is indeed a tight fit, so that's exactly what we want with our chopping up. Next up we have a tree. Looks like it was imported good. Next up we have...
Yeah, that looks pretty clean.
Yep. This guy looks good. What do we want to call this guy?
Bad fish.
Bad fish. Okay, so we have bad fish. Then we have a tube. And the tube is indeed a good fit. Let's work on our upper and our lower. These are good fits. So upper cave, lower cave, and the reason I'm typing upper and lower cave instead of stalagmites and stalactites is I don't want to embarrass myself by telling everyone I can't remember which one is which.
Stalactites stick tight to the roof.
Oh, I guess that's a pretty good mnemonic. Or not mnemonic, but yeah.
And stalagmites might reach them someday.
Well, I also don't know how to spell either of those words, so we'll just leave it at upper cave and lower cave. Alright, so we got our tree, our tubes, our bad fish, our lower cave, our upper cave. Let's go ahead and work on these guys down here on the lower right-hand side, because that's kind of our last row of textures. Right here, this is...
Did it nail it that time?
It did, kind of. It did a weird thing where it like overlapped two sprites onto one.
Oh, there.
Like, I don't get it. So I'm going to delete this overlapping. Well, no, I'm not going to delete it. I'm just going to resize it to fill in this object. Make sure that we get a good fit. Yeah, no.
Ooh, nicely done.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is a stalactite, but upper cave piece. Upper cave piece 2. There we go. That's descriptive enough.
Lovely.
Okay, so now we have those done. We have our microphone, which our microphone was brought in correctly.
Microphone of mass destruction.
Indeed. Then we have our a failure, actually, because I came over here, and remember, when you do an automatic slicing, make sure that you click on everything to make sure that they are indeed there. In this case, we have a failure. I don't know why it failed. Maybe because it's like a pixel or two above, but...
Oh, that might be.
Yeah, Unity got confused. So let's go ahead and just do this manually. I'm going to click drag on it, make sure the lower right is good, make sure the upper left is good. We don't see any feathering, so we can leave it like that. And we'll...
Yep. And that's a tiling piece, so again, it's very important that you snap those tight.
Yep. So we'll call this dirt mid. Then we have a blue saw, which did get pulled in correctly. So we'll call this blue saw. Then we have a dirt full, and just eyeballing it, it looks like we got a good good edges on that. So we'll call this dirt full. Then we have a, what did I call this? I call that blue saw, so let's call this a red saw. And then we have rocks. And that is our main texture atlas. Go ahead and hit apply. Now I'm definitely going to want to look through all of these things to make sure that I've named all of them, and it looks like I missed one name. So texture atlas main 6. I don't know what. Where are you? What? Did you have like a floating pixel or something right there, Steve? That's
not that I knew of, but
all right. So yes, by
can we make him go away?
So again, by taking a look at our names, we can see that we are indeed having a slight error. So let's go and delete that. Hit apply, and then you'll notice he'll disappear.
Now we're happy.
Indeed. All right, so let's go back to our scene view, and let's go ahead and place some dirt really fast. I'm going to start by placing like one piece of dirt. Or let's pull in a dirt full, click and drag. You'll notice that did work again, unfortunately. I wonder if it'd be better if we set its pivot to lower right or lower left. I think actually it would.
You'll get a lot better snapping.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and set the pivot of this guy to lower left. So I'm going to click on dirt full, come over here to our sprite editor, and click on dirt full again. Set its pivot to bottom left, and hit apply.
And while we're here, honestly, all of those pieces that we'll tile, we should do that with.
Okay, I wonder if you can control... Yep, you can control click and select multiple. So I'm going to click on that and that, that, and that. Those are all tileable, right?
Yep, and also your jump pad will be easier if it's there too. And your water.
Actually, no, you can't click control, click. Arrgh. All right, let's just go through. See, this is where it'd be important to set the pivot by default to something. But, Okay, let's go through and set all these pivots, actually. Let's go and do that. Bubble, I'm fine with being at where it is. Grass, I want lower left. Grass 2, I want lower left. No, I want lower mid, or left mid on that. Because you're wanting...
Yeah, because that's going to snap to the corner of
right.
An earth block at its midpoint.
Yep. These guys, let's do lower left. Health, I want center. Star, I want center. Cannon, let's do lower left. Water, let's do lower left. Jump pad, let's do a lower left. Dirt, let's do lower left. Tree, let's do lower center. Tube, let's do lower center. Bad guy, let's do center. These guys are going to be up center. Up center. Microphone is fine being center. This guy is going to be lower left. Buzzsaw is fine being center. This guy is already set to lower left. That buzzsaw is center. Rocks are going to be, how about
lower center?
Yeah, lower center.
And your two big pieces, if we use those for parallaxing, it wouldn't matter too much, but I would probably lower left those too, just to make it simple.
Yeah.
And to be consistent. Well, lower left and upper left.
Right. So lower left and then set this guy to upper left. All right, then hit apply. Now that we have all those pivots set up, placing our object should be a lot simpler. I should have thought about that before, but I didn't. Okay, so let's go ahead and...
It's a good chance to go back and review, though. So,
yeah. So let's go ahead and set this guy to our 0, 0, and we now have dirt. Let's go ahead and throw some grass on him. I don't know if that's how it's supposed to be placed.
That grass is kind of extra grass.
Oh, so I want this grass.
For depth, so yeah, we want grass too. There we go.
Okay, so now we have a object and some grass. Now, you might notice something interesting, and that is all of our sorting has magically worked, and this is actually really frustrating me because the only reason why I'm placing a bunch of stuff onto the scene right now is to show you guys how sorting layers work, and unfortunately everything's sorting properly on first try. Let's try doing something like adding a...
I'm sure we can do a few more and totally screw it up. It's kind of our modus operandi.
Let's do that, and we're still good.
Let's bring in a tree. And let's snap that tree down to the bottom.
All right.
Now that's a problem.
I probably do want to scale it. Nah.
Well, and this is a case where, to save on textures, you could actually do that and use the tree as a bush.
Oh yeah.
But you would want it in the background.
Right. So the problem, here obviously is that thanks Steve for making the stuff blow up so I can show people that
yes,
we do have a problem, and that problem is that our sorting layers are incorrect. So what we want to do with Unity is we want to be very explicit about how we sort our objects. We want certain things to be in the foreground, we want certain things to be in the background. Now you'll notice that in the sprite renderer we have sorting layer and we have order in layer. Sorting layer defines which sorting layer we're applying. Of course, these are just I'm just gonna end up repeating their names. The sorting layer is which sorting layer you're on, and the order in layer is the order in that sorting layer that you're on. But it's true. So what sorting layers allow you to do is they allow you to define. So if I come up here and I hit default and I click add sorting layer, we'll see that we can now define as many layers as we want, and we can change the way that they are ordered when they are rendered. So we could, for example, set our background to one layer, our mountains to another layer, our other background, so like our closer background, like our tree line, for example, to another layer, and then our foreground to another layer. And we'll be adding other layers in addition to that as well as time goes on. Let's go ahead and do that.
Or you can also, you could assign like all of those to a sorting layer and then order them within the layer and then create a separate sorting layer for, say, characters or bad guys or...
Yep. So you see right here, if I have this piece of dirt selected, if I move it up, you'll notice it goes above the grass. If I move it down, you'll notice it goes behind the background. But let's go ahead and get some explicit layers going. So I'm going to come up here to sorting layers and say add sorting layer, and I'm going to create a new one, and I want to create background. I want background to be at the top, so that background sorts last. Then I want mountains, which will be right above background. Then I want tree line, which will be above default. Then I want foreground, which I want default to be above everything. So now that I've done that, let's assign our layers. So let's click on our background and set its sorting layer to background. Now let's click on all of our mountains and add its sorting layer to mountains. Now let's click on our tree and add its sorting layer to tree line, and you'll notice instantly that our tree line goes behind our other elements. Now let's click on our grass and our dirt. There we go. And set its sorting layer to foreground. So now we can duplicate our grass and our dirt, which you'll see that we will run into occasional issues because we definitely want our grass to appear ahead of our dirt. So let's click on all of our grass and set its order and layer to 2, and then keep the order and layer on our dirt to 0. And now we can do stuff like adding more trees, maybe scaling them differently or something to make them look different, and so on and so on. And now we have proper sorting.
Very nice.
Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff that I want to talk about in regards to placing our objects, as well as a couple tricks for not doing things like accidentally selecting things. But I think this pretty much wraps up this video as an introduction to the 2D defaults, as well as an introduction to sprites and editing sprites and pivot points, which managed to find their way into this video somehow. So in the next video, we'll talk more about some easy ways to place sprites in our world, creating prefabs and all that fun stuff. So
Woohoo.
yeah, see you guys next video.